Good afternoon, and welcome to our educational webinar, Compare and Contrast, Rule-Based Scoring and Machine Learning-Based Scoring in Sleep Medicine. My name is Rachel Bohr, and I'm the Senior Marketing Director at EnsoData. I want to apologize, we're not able to show our video. It seems our webinar platform is having issues with the webcam. So I certainly apologize that you will not see our faces unless it connects sometime in the middle of the webinar. But we certainly appreciate you all taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. All right, now I'd like to introduce Yoav to you. Yoav is an engineering manager on the artificial intelligence team at EnsoData. He holds a Master of Science in Biomedical Engineering from Tel Aviv University in Israel, and his work has been published in several peer-reviewed journals. Yoav brings healthcare AI and machine learning experience to EnsoData and currently leads a team of machine learning engineers as well as various research projects with EnsoData's partners and collaborators. And with that, I will pass it over to Yoav.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And thank you for everyone that joined us today for this webinar. So like Rachel mentioned, the title of this webinar is Compare and Contrast Rule-Based Scoring and Machine Learning-Based Scoring in Sleep Medicine. So today, in kind of the next hour or so, I'll be talking about AI, the different methods used in AI, AI in healthcare, AI in sleep medicine, and then also more specifically, I'll talk about the different methods of automatic sleep scoring, more specifically in this case, rule-based versus machine learning-based scoring in sleep medicine. So in order to really effectively compare these two methods, I kind of decided to split this webinar into two parts. The first part, that part is going to be mostly dedicated to AI. I'll define what AI is, what software-assisted automation is. I'll define machine learning, deep learning, and also I'll try and kind of create this structure and organization between AI, machine learning, and deep learning, because these terms are being used out there quite a bit, and they use them interchangeably. So I'm going to try and create some sort of organization and explain the relationship between those different terms. Then I'll also give kind of like a really nice handful of examples from the real world today. And then the next part is going to be dedicated to AI in sleep medicine. I'll compare between rule-based and machine learning-based sleep scoring. And then at the very end, I'll also kind of like discuss the current and future state of AI in medicine, sleep medicine. So let's begin. So let's start by defining what is artificial intelligence or AI. Now, AI is a very broad field of study. It contains a variety of different methods, including machine learning and deep learning. But outside of these two methods, which I'll get to in a second, it also contains more basic logical rules, kind of like the explicitly defined logical rules that have this structure of if then else rules in order to automate some sort of task. And essentially anything that tries to mimic human behavior or human intelligence can be regarded as AI. So, you know, at the end of the day, even your most basic calculator can be regarded as some form of AI. Now, the main AI topic today is software-assisted automation. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page, what I mean by that is basically referring to any kind of algorithm that is designed to automate some sort of task that would otherwise be done manually by a human. And these software-assisted automation algorithms or technologies often have a very simple structure. They interact with user input and manipulate those inputs in order to come up with some sort of output, answer, outcome, and so on. And the two main types of software-assisted automation I'll be speaking about are rule-based automation and machine learning-based automation. So let's start by talking about rule-based automation. Now, this is kind of like a figure that tries to illustrate the idea of rule-based automation a little bit better. In general, what this is all about is basically using these explicitly defined rules, like I mentioned before, and basically seeing how the data interact with these kind of rules in order to come up with some sort of answer or outcome or output. So a few examples that you might be familiar with from your day-to-day lives. The first one is a thermostat, right? You might want to specify the desired temperature at your house or apartment, And then the thermostat has, these temperature sensors that detect the temperature at your apartment. And then if the temperature is higher than the desired temperature, it will turn on cooling. If it is below, it will turn on heating. Otherwise, it won't do anything, right? So it has this very specific if then else kind of structure. Another example that many of you might have interacted with before are chatbots. Now, in order to really kind of like illustrate the whole idea behind rule-based automation, I want to kind of dive into this chatbot example a little bit more in depth. So let's say you're interacting with some sort of chatbot from a healthcare provider. You might log into a website and you might be greeted with some sort of greeting message. And then it might ask you a question like, would you like to schedule an appointment? If you say yes, it will take you down that path of scheduling an appointment. If you say no, it might ask you another question like, would you like to refill a prescription? If you say yes, it will take you down that path. And, as some of you might have experienced before, if you, express some magic words of frustration, it might automatically just connect you to a human agent. Now, obviously this is an extreme simplification of, this whole idea of chatbots, but the idea stays the same, right? The usual chatbots have a variety of different paths and branches that you can move through, but the idea is that you keep on going down those paths until this whole chatbot session ends. And this is exactly what rule-based automation is all about, right? Using these predefined, explicitly defined logical rules in order to produce some sort of outcome. All right, now let's talk about machine learning based automation. But in order to talk about machine learning based automation, let's first define what machine learning is. Now, if we remember the AI circle that we saw earlier, machine learning falls within that general circle of AI, where rule-based automation also falls within AI, but outside of machine learning. And what's unique about these machine learning approaches, it basically kind of refers to any type of algorithm, or we often call them models, that are able to learn a specific task and get better over time the more data that they see and interact with. So, very much like a newborn learns how to perform a specific task based on trial and error, or learns how to detect an image of a cat, the more images of cats she sees, a machine learning model learns with experience as well. So let's discuss briefly, the different ingredients that you might need in order to build a machine learning algorithm. The first thing you might need is a data set. Now, the data set is often comprised by input data, and often each input data is associated with its output label. Now, let's say in healthcare, the input data can be anything from medical images like MRI, X-rays, CTs, and so on. It can be tabular data like electronic medical record data. It can be also waveform or signals or physiological signals as well. And the labels can be anything from, if there is or isn't a cancerous growth in the image, if a patient has a likelihood to develop some sort of disease based on their historical medical record, or, in sleep medicine, what sleep stage is represented by a certain window of EEG signals. Now, in order to try and simplify this as much as I can, let's take a look at a very, very simple example where our inputs are just images of animals, in this case cats and dogs, and the labels might be something like if this is an image of a dog or an image of a cat. The next thing that you will need, obviously, is the machine learning model. Now, what's unique about these models is that they are all they are at the end of the day are just a series of millions or sometimes even billions of parameters and mathematical manipulations that can interact with your input data in order to output some sort of prediction or label and so on. And depending on the specific task that you would like to perform, that will help you choose the machine learning model that you would want to use. And a few kind of like examples of tasks that you might want to do or perform or teach the machine learning model to perform are regression, classification, and object detection. And what I mean by that, for example, regression is, let's say, looking at images of dogs, and the model will learn to output the number of dogs in the image. Classification is basically looking at an image of an animal and saying if it's an image of a cat or a dog. And object detection is basically, looking at an image of cats and dogs and finding the exact location of the dog in the image. So depending on which task you would want to perform, you'll choose the right machine learning model. And then you might also, depending on the input data, that will also affect your decision, because you would want to choose a machine learning model that's able to process the input data that you have. And you might want to choose, between kind of like more classical machine learning methods or the more modern machine learning methods like deep learning, which I will get to in a moment. And then finally, what you would need is a training algorithm. Now, this training algorithm contains two main parts. The first part is an error function. And all this is basically a value or a metric that is able to compare between the ground truth labels and the output of the model. The next thing, or the final thing that you would need, is an optimizer. And the whole goal in life for this optimizer is to try and minimize the error function as much as possible. And the way it does that is can go in to the machine learning model and change its parameters and those learnable parameters and tweak them slightly in order to try and make sure that the model is able to perfectly match between the input data and the output labels, such that at the end of a training process, the error function would be minimized as much as possible. So let's take a look. People talk about how these machine models can learn and can train over and get better over time. So I do want to spend a couple of minutes just to kind of like illustrate what this training or learning process might look like. So as I mentioned, you start with your machine learning model, and those models are defined with million or billion learnable parameters. And you can imagine that at the very beginning of the training process, these models will just be initialized with some sort of random labels. So at the beginning, if you try to feed in some sort of input data, it would output a prediction that has no correlation with the ground truth labels whatsoever. And this whole training process is an iterative process. And what happens each iteration, the model receives a set of input data. It processes the input data in order to produce some sort of predicted label. And then that predicted label is compared with the ground truth labels. And then, you would use your error function to assess the differences between the target label and the predicted label. And that is where the optimizer comes in and changes and tweaks the model's parameter in order to try and minimize that error as much as possible. And this whole process happens over and over and over again until, eventually, hopefully, you end up with a trained model that can accurately match between the input data and the output labels. Now, this whole process mimics something that, we all do in almost every day, and we do that subconsciously without even thinking about it. And one example is, for example, let's say if there's a basketball player that is trying to practice their three-pointers, right? They might initially try to throw the ball and it won't go in the basket. And the player might assess the distance between the ball and the basket, adjust the throw, and try again. And then slowly the ball might get closer and closer and closer to the basket until it eventually goes in the basket. And what we have here is, the distance between the ball and the basket, that is essentially our error function, where the mental process that we do automatically of adjusting the throw, that is essentially the whole purpose of the optimizer. And what might this look like in sleep medicine, right? All you need is just to choose the right input data and the right target label. So for example, here you can train a model to receive a window of EEG signals and then output if that window specifies sleep or wake. So if we remember the rule-based figure we saw earlier, let's take a look now at a very similar figure specifically for machine learning-based automation. So before, instead of having data interacting with predefined rules to come up with the answers, in this case, we have data and answers that train a machine learning model in order to come up with the rules for us. So now let's talk about deep learning. Now, if we take a look at our AI circle again, deep learning falls within machine learning. And outside of deep learning, a few machine learning algorithms that you might be familiar with, clustering is one example, logistic regression or linear regression, random forest, and so on. And what's unique about deep learning, right? Deep learning is a subclass of machine learning methods. And what's unique about them is that they leverage something called artificial neural networks that are inspired by the neural networks that we have, in our brains. And what's unique about these models is that they can leverage a huge amount of data in order to basically learn even more complex representation of our input data, much more complex than the representations of those more classical machine learning approaches. And what these models can do is extract both low-level and low resolution and high resolution features in order to perform some sort of task. So in images, it can be pixel level information like color, intensity, texture. And in waveform data or signal data, it can be the waveform frequency, the waveform shape or amplitude. So the same way you can train a deep learning model to detect an image of a cat or a dog, you can train it to classify a sleep waveform as well. This is one kind of like visualization that tries to illustrate how these deep learning, or what these deep learning models usually look like. Now, this model was trained to accurately detect handwritten digits, and what you can see here is a bunch of kind of like millions of dots and lines that just light up. And what those are the learnable parameters and mathematical manipulations that I spoke about earlier, and how they interact with the input data in order to accurately produce the label. This is another illustration that kind of like demonstrates what these deep learning models see. So you can see that they're very good at extracting edges, intensities, colors, contours, textures, and so on. So they can use all of these kind of like information to accurately classify which fruit is in each image. So now let's take a look at some real-world examples of machine learning and deep learning. So the first example that might come to mind are autonomous vehicles. And I mean, whenever you ask someone about AI, this is often the first kind of like example people think about. And you can imagine that for autonomous vehicles, what usually happens is that those cars have a range of sensors and cameras attached to different positions of the vehicles. And then what happens is real-time footage is processed by a variety of different deep learning models in order to detect different things about the environment of the cars. For example, it can detect the lane that the car is driving on. And then it can use that information and feed that information to the algorithms that are controlling the driving of the car to make sure that the car doesn't diverge from the lane that it's on. And then, it can detect the cars from front, the distance of the cars from the back, positions of pedestrians, obstacles, buildings all around, and basically use all of that information to provide a very safe driving experience. And here in this specific example, you can see the real world kind of like footage that's being captured and how that data is converted into some sort of data form that can easily be digested by the algorithms that are controlling the driving of the car. So another example that might not necessarily immediately come to mind when we're thinking about AI, but this is an application that many of us use, is Netflix. And what Netflix uses, they basically come up with something called recommendation systems. And for recommendation systems, they use different machine learning approaches and different data types like your viewing preference, similar archetypes of movie watchers across the globe, right? If there are other people, in your area or around the world that like similar TV shows and movies like you, and the popularity of TV shows all around the world as well. And basically, the engineers use all of that data to train these personal machine learning models that can give you a more personalized user experience by customizing your app feed and giving you recommendations for the next movie or the next TV show you might want to watch next. Now, the next example I want to talk about, and this got a lot of attention recently, is ChatGPT. This was developed by a company called OpenAI. This is a free tool, by the way, that you can access online. I have the link here on the bottom left. And what this specific tool does, it's essentially a chatbot on steroids. You can basically go in there and interact with the chatbot. It's highly interactive. You can have conversation with it. You can ask it to perform different tasks. And it can essentially do almost anything that you can imagine. You can write songs for you, essays, emails, presentation outlines, and so on. So almost anything that you can think of. So what I did is I basically tried the first thing that came to mind, and or at least in my mind, And I basically asked it to generate a sleep study report for a patient with 50 apnea events, 60 hypopnea events, and the total sleep time of 4 hours. Now, I won't read the whole thing, and obviously this is not a perfect report, and these reports are highly dependent on the preference of the different sleep physicians. But a few things I do want to highlight, was able to say that the patient slept for 4 hours, had 50 apnea, 60 hypopneas, but not only that, it also knew that it had to calculate the apnea-hypopnea index of the patient, and it did it correctly, in this case, 27.5, right? 50 plus 60 divided by 4, that gives you the correct answer. So, another thing that was pretty impressive was also able to make the connection between this AHI and the severity of the obstructive sleep apnea, in this case, moderate. And this is correct, right? Moderate sleep apnea is between AHI between 15 and 30. And then it gives some conclusions and recommendations, and also identified CPAP as like a potential treatment. So this really shows the power of these kind of tools to automate a lot of the work that we are doing today manually. Another example is DALL-E, also a tool created by OpenAI, also free, and you can see the link right here on the bottom left. And what this tool does, it is able to interpret user text in order to generate some sort of image. So what I did here is I asked DALL-E to generate an image of a chest X-ray with a cancerous growth in the right lung. So first of all, you can see that it generated an image that really looks like a realistic chest X-ray. But not only that, you can see that also in the right lung, it did generate some abnormality in the right lung, right? Now, is this cancer? Maybe, you can't really know. It can also be pneumonia. But regardless, this really shows the power of these kind of tools to generate very realistic images based on user input. Now, one example for when this might be useful, or from at least the machine learning world, in order to train these machine learning models, you need a lot of data, and the size of the data that you need isn't always available, and the engineers or researchers usually need to go out there and collect more examples and label them, which can be very expensive and very time consuming. So you can imagine how tools like this be used by engineers in order to generate new observations for the data set that they can then use to train the machine learning model to perform whatever task that they would want. Another example I want to share here is how AI is being used for skin cancer detection. Now, this is being used a lot today, and there are many companies being created these days that are trying to leverage this technology. This was initially done by a research group at Stanford and published in Nature in 2017. And what they did here is train deep learning models in order on 129,000 clinical skin images, and compared the performance of these models against 21 board-certified dermatologists. And what they found is that the performance of their models are basically on par with the average dermatologist. Now, one thing I want to emphasize about this example, if you think about this, essentially democratized skin cancer screening to basically anyone that has a smartphone, right? So as we start to think about, addressing healthcare disparities in rural areas or around the world, in developing countries around the world that have very limited access to healthcare, these kind of tools can really increase accessibility to healthcare worldwide. Now, these days you can't really have a presentation without a COVID-19 example. So here's one final example for you. And this got a lot of attention, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, where it was very difficult to get a hold on of home sleep tests. And what the researchers did here is they were able to build a web-based tool where anyone could go in, record a cough, and then mark it whether or not they were diagnosed with COVID-19. And then the researchers were able to train these deep learning models to basically extract very specific frequencies and features from the patient's cough, and use all of that data in order to accurately detect the coronavirus infection with close to 95% accuracy. Now, obviously, in order to really trust this kind of technology, it needs to go through a lot of testing and a lot of validation, but it does bring up two main points that I do want to highlight. The first one is, similar to the example that we saw with the skin cancer screening, this is another perfect example where we can really start leveraging these technologies to improve the whole process of remote patient monitoring. And you can really use these technologies to, increase the effectiveness of these different monitoring tools and make it much more scalable and accessible around the world. The second thing I also want to highlight here is, these types of models are really starting to show that they can open up doors that, previously have seemed impossible. I mean, these models can basically detect features and information that we can't with our five senses. And so it seems like these models are really able to create a lot more information in the data that we already have. All right, so now you're all AI experts. So, just a quick recap. AI is a very broad field of study. Within it, it has machine learning, deep learning. Each method has kind of like its own approaches. But one final thing I want to kind of like emphasize before I close out this section and move to the next section is that a lot of the examples that I just shared would have been very difficult or even impossible to implement 10 or even 15 or even 10 years ago, and only truly became possible in recent years with kind of like all of the surge of developments in this whole field of deep learning and machine learning. All right, so now let's talk about rule-based versus machine learning-based auto-scoring in sleep medicine. So for all of the folks attending this webinar that are not coming from the sleep medicine world, a very quick kind of like overview of sleep medicine. There are different sleep disorders that are being diagnosed. The main, or one of the main ones, is obstructive sleep apnea, or OSA. Now, it's assumed that if OSA affects over 50 million people in the USA and over 900 million globally. But not only that, it is assumed that between 80 to 90% of the patients with OSA are actually undiagnosed. Now, in order to diagnose sleep apnea and other sleep disorders, the patient often goes in for a sleep study. And we have two main sleep studies. We have a polysomnography, or PSG, that is a study that's being done in lab at the clinic. Or we have home sleep apnea test, or HSAT, that are being done at the patient's home. Now, during these studies, we record a range of different signals for the whole duration that the patient is asleep. So for example, like pulmonary data like airflow and respiratory effort, cardio data like ECG, pulse oximetry, and also neurological data like EEG, EOG, EMG. And you can imagine that all of this data needs to be processed, often without using auto-scoring. This is often done manually in order to accurately and efficiently diagnose the different sleep disorders. Now, throughout the years, we've just seen, the demand for sleep testing to just, go up and up. We are really in a situation where, the demand exceeds the supply. And also, because this whole kind of like scoring process can be very time consuming, you can imagine that this can really limit the time that the sleep physicians or other clinicians can spend with their patients and kind of like create this more personalized treatment plan. So let's take a look quickly at kind of like the timeline or the history of sleep scoring. And it's always nice to see how far sleep medicine came from the late 60s. Now, the late 60s, that is when kind of like Rochstaffen and Kales formalized the very first manual for sleep stage scoring. Now, back then, initially it was done manually on hard copies of more than 900 or more pages. The mid-90s, that is when all of that kind of like hard copies were digitalized into the PSG viewers that are computer softwares. 2007, that is when the American Association of Sleep Medicine published the very first manual for scoring of sleep events and associated events. It was released in 2007. 2011, that is only when the FDA cleared the very first software-assisted automated sleep scoring technology. Now, initially, that software used rule-based scoring, and only in 2017, that is when the FDA cleared the very first machine learning-based scoring, which happens to be EnsoData's EnsoSleep. And since 2017, 2011 until now, these softwares have just gradually got better and better over time with new capabilities added each year. So let's take a look, focus now on software-assisted auto-scoring, and let's take a look at an example how this workflow might look like. Now, I'm going to use EnsoSleep as an example because that is the main product I can speak for, but you can imagine that similar workflows can be adapted for other programs as well. So in this specific, for EnsoSleep, usually happens is basically data collected from existing PSG and HSAT devices are automatically uploaded to the cloud using some sort of local application or API without the need for any, export or import by the user. Then all of that data is processed by EnsoSleep's AI engine in the cloud in order to automate the scoring of the different sleep stages, the different sleep events, and basically essentially reducing the time it takes for a clinician to review a sleep study. Without auto scoring, the average time it would take is around 60 minutes, and we found that with EnsoSleep, the amount of time it can take to review a study can be under 15 minutes. And then finally, all of that data is transferred back to the clinic and automatically is displayed on the native viewers that the clinics have in lab without needing to disrupt any clinical workflows. And this is how this might look like, right? So instead of opening the sleep study for the very first time and just seeing the raw signals, you might see, those events that already overlay the signals. So, you can see your arousals, apneas, apopneas, the different sleep stages. So almost like someone did kind of like a first pass for you, and now all you need to do is just review the sleep study and just correct it when needed and generate the report. So in order to kind of create this automated scoring technology, there are softwares that might use only rule-based auto-scoring. There are softwares that might use only machine learning-based auto-scoring. What we found to be most useful for EnsoSleep is to basically use a combination of the two approaches. So again, rule-based, right, data interacting with rules to come up with answers, and machine learning-based data and answers to train a machine learning algorithm in order to come up with the rules for you. So some examples for where rule-based auto-scoring might be useful. So for those more simple event types like oxygen desaturation, tachycardia, bradycardia, right? So you can imagine that you can very easily define a simple algorithm for bradycardia, for example, that monitors the heart rate of the patient. And if the heart rate is below 60 beats per minute, it will mark bradycardia. Otherwise, it won't mark that event type. And for machine learning-based scoring, that is more useful for the more complex event types like sleep staging, sleep disorder breathing events like apneas, hypopneas, and so on, arousal detection and leg movements. So, basically using a machine learning model to take in a window of EEG signal and output the associated sleep stage. A few kind of like strengths and weaknesses for each one of the approaches. So for rule-based, it uses very well-defined, explainable rules that are very easy to think about and define. It doesn't need a lot of high computational power, right? It doesn't need all of the training process that we usually need for machine learning that can be very time-consuming and really requires a lot of computation power. And it's also fairly simple to implement. Some weaknesses, some of kind of like these events some of the events that use rules that are more complex than this kind of like simple if this then that formula. Rule-based is not a very good fit for these events. And also rule-based auto-scoring is very sensitive to outliers and the noise and really highly depend on proper lead placement. So if the data coming in is different than the data that, let's say the engineer used when they formulated the rule-based algorithms, that is when these kind of like rule-based methods really break down. Some strengths and weaknesses for machine learning based. So first of all, it mimics human behavior, which is part of the reason why, it can really seem like it can really perform with very high accuracy and seems like almost like another human did the initial scoring for you. It's scalable. What I mean by that is, these machine learning models don't suffer from fatigue. So essentially, they can process thousands of studies 24/7 without getting tired. And with the right amount of data and for the right application, you can really get a massive gain in accuracy compared to these rule-based methods. A few weaknesses, in order to really get that performance increase, you need a lot of high quality data, and sometimes that isn't available, and that can really limit the different applications of those kind of machine learning based auto scoring. It may lack explainability, and what I mean by that is that and this is especially true for the deep learning models, is that it's often very difficult or even impossible to explain why these models are making their specific decisions or outputting a specific prediction, and might sometimes are just treated like black boxes, which can, surely be something that can, affect the trustworthiness of these types of models. But if we combine these models together with human intervention and human reviews and a lot of really rigorous validation and testing, that is when we can basically use all of that information to increase our trust for these types of models. And the very last thing, these models can learn inherent biases. And what I mean by that is, these machine learning models are just as good as the data that you use to train them. So if the data that you have has some sort of bias inherent in it, then if you use that data to train your models will learn that bias and you will end up with biased models. So if you are not careful with the data that you collect and the way you validate your models, you might end up with biased models that nobody wants. All right, so let's now take a look at kind of like the current state of AI in sleep medicine, and then we'll also talk about the future. So, from screening, diagnosis to treatment, I mean, AI in sleep medicine is currently being used across the kind of like whole patient pathway in order to provide a more efficient, cost-effective, and accurate experience. So in screening, for example, indices like StopBank or questionnaires like StopBank, Berlin, NOSAS, which is like a more modern machine learning-based method, are all being used today to kind of like really efficiently screen for undiagnosed OSA. The figure that I have here kind of like illustrates the difference in performance for these three indices. In diagnosis, I mean, we spoke about this. We have AI automated sleep scoring that's being used today in order to make this whole diagnosis process more efficient. But not only that, these scoring softwares can now also pretty accurately detect wake versus sleep in type 3 and type 4 home sleep tests that don't have the required EEG signals. And the image you can see here is kind of like a validation that we run where we compared machine learning based total sleep time algorithm that leverages the PPG signal that is being scored in home sleep tests, and we got a fairly high agreement between the real sleep scoring and the PPG scoring. And finally, in treatment, technologies like the AutoPAP, which tries to build upon and improve upon the more conventional PAP machines, right? Using kind of like algorithms in order to automatically adjust the pressure of the machine and cater for the patient's requirements during the night. Now, this is rule-based, but it's AI nonetheless. And another final example here, and this is what we have in the figure right here, is for example, Philips machine learning-based PAP mask fitting. So trying to use machine learning to take out the guesswork when you first try to find the best fitting mask for a patient that was recently prescribed with a PAP machine. So now let's take a look at the future of AI. So a few examples. I mean, the future of AI in sleep medicine truly seems very bright. There are constant of new applications being released every single year. And in screening, a few things that we might start to expect seeing more and more often is, for example, leveraging all of the questionnaires that we already have, but also using additional EMR data and machine learning in order to come up with better screening tools, not only for OSA, but also for other sleep disorders as well. And the second thing that I also want to mention for screening is using machine learning and all the data that we have to create more personalized screening tools. And what I mean by that is, today there's a lot of shift in the focus and a lot of understanding that many of these screening tools don't work very well across different populations, especially for represented populations. I mean, many of us know that, OSA prevalence and incidence can vary drastically across different populations, and OSA expression can vary drastically across different demographic groups. So we can really expect how machine learning and rigorous testing would be used in the future to really come up with more generalizable screening tools that can generalize to the entire population. And one example that I have here is from research that we published a few years ago. And what we did is we compared the performance of the regular StopBank calculation that's being used today for the screening of OSA And then we took the exact same responses and that we're getting from the STOP-AD questionnaire, but this time we train a machine learning model to, instead of using the regular calculation, to come up with its own calculations. And what we're able to see is the machine learning based STOP-AD screening tool often outperforms the more regular kind of like the STOP-AD screening tool that's being used today. And we saw that across two different independent data sets. In diagnosis, one theme that we're starting to see, and people are, clinicians are talking more often these days, is, many people are starting to appreciate that the AHI is far from being a perfect index. So one thing that we can start seeing in the future is machine learning and all of the data that we are collecting today to either build on top of the AHI or come up with new indices that better represent disease burden and long-term health outcomes. And the second thing here is, and this is a really important point I want to emphasize, is, I'm not familiar with many other, healthcare or physical tests out there that record so many information about a patient. Think about it, the average sleep study is around between 6 to 8 hours, and it records a vast amount of different signals, whether it's neurological signals with EEG, respiratory activity, cardiological signals with ECG, pulse oximetry, leg movements. And so, this is a lot of data that not only, might take a lot of time to be processed by humans, but not only that, similar to the COVID-19 example that we saw earlier, there is probably a lot more information in that data that we're just not leveraging today. So we can really imagine how we can start using AI and all of the data that we already have in order to automate the detection of different sleep disorders, but not only sleep disorders, other disorders as well. And a few examples that I have here. Here on the left, this is from a research that was done by Dr. Emmanuel Mignot's group at Stanford. And what they were able to show is that they can train deep learning models to process a full night PSG study and very accurately, with very high accuracy, detect whether the patient does or doesn't have narcolepsy. And the other example that I have here, and this is something that a research that we published a few years ago, and in this case, we trained a deep learning model in order to also process a full night PSG study, but here we trained it to basically try and classify or detect the age of the patient. And what we were able to do is we basically saw that these models are accurately able to detect the real age of the patient within kind of like plus or minus 5 years, which, it's pretty remarkable. And not only that, we were able to show that whenever our models predicted a much higher age compared to the real chronological age of the patient, we're able to see that these kind of like differences are correlated, statistically significantly correlated with different disorders like depression, diabetes, hypertension, and so on. And then finally, in treatment, a few things we're going to start seeing is, using all of the data that we have, along with different machine learning and AI methods, in order to come up with more personalized treatment plans. So for example, for sleep apnea treatment, you can imagine you can use these machine learning tools and the data that we have to basically try and assess the perfect treatment for a patient, right? So, would a patient be a better fit for an oral appliance, a nasal appliance, a CPAP machine, some type of surgery, or more kind of like, or newer treatment methods like hypoglossal nerve stimulation. So using all of that data to try and come up with a more personalized treatment plan for the patient. And the other point here is using AI and machine learning to kind of like improve the whole kind of like treatment monitoring and management that's being done today. And this is especially important, for the PAP treatment. As many of you know and appreciate, it's very often very difficult to get patients to continuously use a PAP machine, and it usually involves a lot of kind of like outreach and interactions with the patients. So you can imagine how AI and machine learning can be used to try and forecast at-risk risk patients, patients that are about to become inadherent for example, based on CMS criteria, are about to become inadherent with the PAP machine. And you can imagine how all of this data can be provided to sleep physicians, DME companies, and sleep coaches in order to try and help them prioritize their patient list and identify the at-risk patients that they should reach out to. And the example that I have here, this is a research that we published last year. And what we did here is we trained a deep learning model to detect negative effort dependence events. And what these events are basically shapes that appear in the nasal flow channel during apnea events. And there are other publications out there that basically show that there's association between those. There are three different types. Between these three different types of NED events, there is an association with the anatomical structure of the collapse of the upper airway. And not only that, it's been found that there is also an association between the types of collapsing of the upper airway with the success with various treatments, especially hypoglossal nerve stimulation. And what we did here, we are able to train this deep learning model to automatically detect these NED events. And then we assess the different prevalences of these events and try to kind of like run statistical analysis to try and find the association between the different events and the responsiveness to hypoglossal nerve stimulation. And what we found is that the main event that had the largest kind of positive association with the success of hypoglossal nerve stimulation is NED minimal. And this makes sense because NED minimal has been found to be associated with the retroglossal collapsing of the upper airway, which makes us for hypoglossal nerve stimulation because that is the exact area that is being targeted for that specific treatment. All right, so that is pretty much it. So, in conclusion, we basically saw that AI is a very broad field of study that, encompasses a range of different methods. We saw that, machine learning and deep learning are being used in the real world today and are actually at the forefront of most AI applications. We saw that, for with the right amount of data and the right application, deep learning often outperforms the more classical machine learning methods. And also we saw, that AI is not perfect. It still requires kind of like human review and human intervention. And I mean, the way I see it, AI is, here to empower humans and not necessarily replace them, right? AI is here to help us save time and allow us to basically grow and focus on kind of the aspects either in our life or in our profession that either interest us the most, or, for example, in healthcare and sleep medicine, allow physicians to focus more attention on the patients. And then finally, we saw that AI in sleep medicine is evolving very quickly. A lot more applications being released and published every single year, and it really seems like there's a very, very bright future on the horizon. So with that, that concludes my presentation. Thank you everyone for the attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.